I'm proud to be an honorary Upper West Sider. I hope I can claim that. How many people can honestly say that they spent their wedding night at the Hotel Empire? I can honestly say that. But when my wife and I were married in some chapel at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, there was a reception, and we then made our getaway, not in a limousine, but on whichever number bus it is that goes past the cathedral. I don't know which it is, but my wife is an Upper West Side expert, knew which bus to catch to get to the Hotel Empire, and off we went.
I love that.
Yeah. So thank you all very much. And I sure wish I could be with you in person, not just because I bet you're interesting people. Wait a minute, something has just flashed up. Eleanor Berman is requesting remote control of your screen.
Sorry, we've denied Eleanor.
Do I decline that?
Don't you worry about any of that, Charlie. I'll manage it from the back end.
Okay. So, so at any rate, I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. I'm glad I can be with you by Zoom. I have recently written a book. It actually took 8 years, so it doesn't seem very recent to me. And this is the cover of it, the North Atlantic Cities. I like the picture. I can't claim that I took it. This was taken by Johannes Vermeer in about 1670, and he's better at this than I am. This book, The North Atlantic Cities, has a purpose. The purpose is to introduce a 4-word phrase into the English language. And the 4 words are the North Atlantic Cities. It's a kind of a city. Nobody's ever really recognized it as a kind of a city, but it is a kind of a city. And if you want to treat these cities correctly, it's useful to start by knowing what kind of cities they are. Now, what the heck am I talking about? Here's a little bit of, that's right, my arrow is over here for Landmark West. When I walk out of the front door of my house in Baltimore, this is what I see. Baltimore is a city of what we call row houses. You would probably call them brownstones. Everybody's got a different name for them, but whatever it is, we have a lot of them. When I was growing up in Baltimore, I took it for granted that cities had row houses, at least in the center. Baltimore certainly did. When I went and visited aunts and uncles in Washington, in Georgetown, Georgetown certainly did. Philadelphia was nearby, no shortage of row houses in Philadelphia. Philadelphia has more row houses than any city in the country. And even New York felt like home, at least in some places. New York, if New York wasn't the greatest skyscraper city in the world, it would be known as one of the greatest row house or brownstone cities in the world. So when I was growing up in this relatively narrow strip of land on the East Coast of the United States, didn't travel much, I had an idea, very clear idea of what a city was. And a city was a thing that had row houses, preferably lots of them. When I was 20, through the miracle of a junior year abroad, I found myself here in London. And London, in some important respects, was different from Baltimore, Washington, Philadelphia, and New York, but there was one respect in which it was very similar. London had row houses, even more than Philadelphia, even more than Baltimore. London has more row houses than any city in the world. What did I think about that? Didn't think much about it. I assumed that every city in the world had row houses. Well, about a year later, at the end of a junior year abroad, 2 of my schoolmates came over. We got on a little packet in a small British port, and 5 hours later, we were here in Paris. It's pointless to try to say something new about Paris. Almost everything you can say about Paris has been said, and has been said better than I could say it. But I think I can say something about Paris that you may never have heard said before. Paris does not have row houses. You heard it here. Paris does not have row houses. You walk through Paris and it's probably the most beautiful city in the world. But these wonderful palatial buildings that line the streets and avenues and boulevards of Paris are apartment buildings. Paris does not have row houses. And as I've researched this under the guidance of a good historian of 17th and 18th century France, I found that Paris never really did have row houses. So by the time I was 21 years old, I spent the summer bumming around Europe, and I found that the cities of continental Europe were all sort of cities in the school of Paris. They were cities of apartment houses with brilliant street life and high density. So by the time I was 21, I realized that not every city was like Greenwich Village or Baltimore. There was a completely different way of building cities, a way built on apartment houses with high density and brilliant street life. 2 years later, when I was 23, a college friend invited me to visit him on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, and I crossed the Appalachians for the first time in my life. I found myself in what one could call continental North America, not coastal North America, continental North America. And here's where I really wish that we were in the same room, because I love to show this picture to a live audience and then to ask people, which city is this? I've done this a number of times, and I think people have given me answers including every city in the Midwest and the West of the United States. People have looked at this and they've said Minneapolis, they've looked at it and they've said Indianapolis, they've said Dallas, they've said Houston, they've said St. Louis, they've said Los Angeles, one person even said Chicago, although I'm kind of missing the lake. The answer turns out to be Houston, but that's not the important thing. What's important is that educated, well-traveled Americans can look at this picture and not be sure which American city it is. Why is that important? Because it shows that this, Houston, is fairly typical of the cities of continental North America. This is a fairly typical way for Americans to build cities on the west side of the Appalachian Mountains. Take a look at this for a minute. It's very different from Paris. The center of it is a skyscraper downtown. And in Houston, those tallest skyscrapers that you can see are 80 stories tall. They're big. Houston's a big place. And when you're in the center of downtown Houston, you could be excused for thinking that you're somewhere in Midtown Manhattan. It's a place of extreme density. But look what happens as soon as you get out of that very dense skyscraper core. One friend of mine looked at this picture and said, it all looks like Arlington Cemetery. Well, yes, it's a place of extraordinarily low density. Houston is built at 5 units to the acre. Paris and New York are at 200 units to the acre. So here I was, 23 years old, wandering around continental North America, and I realized that in this thing that we call the Western tradition, there wasn't just one way of building cities. And in fact, there wasn't even just 2 ways of building cities. There were 3 ways of building cities. And I thought this was interesting, and I wondered why this was true. And I figured that somebody must have written a book about it. I thought, I can't be the first person in the world who ever noticed this, and it's pretty obvious, and it's pretty important. I want to read the book that tells me why this is so. By the time I was 55, I realized that I had never found that book. It's hard for me to believe that nobody ever noticed what I noticed when I was in my early 20s. All I can conclude is that nobody else ever thought they could get tenure for writing about it. Since I don't care whether I get tenure or not, I said, this is a good question, and I want to figure out why it is that some cities have row houses and some don't. Some are built on apartment buildings and some aren't. Some are suburbs surrounding skyscrapers and some are not. So I decided to start with the cities that have row houses and figure out why they are what they are and see where that led me. And it turned out to lead me to the 2 coasts of the North Atlantic Ocean. The Middle Atlantic states, the coastal strip going back as far west as Pittsburgh or Cincinnati on our side, from Richmond to New York with outliers in Boston and Savannah. That's the American row house belt. The European row house belt includes the Netherlands, Belgium, the British Isles, and the Republic of Ireland. So here you have a region of architecture and city building divided by a large ocean, by the North Atlantic Ocean. And that was my clue to the fact that the North Atlantic Ocean does not really divide this region. It has historically united it through the greatest trade routes and migration routes in modern human history, which began in about 1600. So I said, okay, is 1600 when this story begins? And it turned out the 1600s were a good place to start to look at the cities on the two coasts of the North Atlantic. Because here you've got the North Atlantic cities, and here you've got the most beautiful picture ever painted of any North Atlantic city by Johannes Vermeer in about 1670. As late as 1600, the cities of Northern Europe, that's Europe north of the Alps, were a mess. This is a drawing of some houses in Shakespeare's London. This is London in about 1600. These are big houses. They're 5 stories tall. These are not the humble hovels of the London poor. These are big houses. But big as they are, they're rickety shacks. I didn't know you could have a 5-story shack, but when you do research, you learn things. You could have a 5-story shack. London, Paris, all the great cities of Northern Europe, as late as 1600, were built of wood. And they often had exterior plaster. And if you think about how wood holds up in a wet climate, if you think about how exterior plaster holds up in a wet climate, the answer is they don't hold up very well. And you can see that in this picture. If you will look at the center of the picture, you'll see that there's a narrow street between these two houses. And up at the 3rd floor level, you'll see something running from one house to another, something that looks like a log. You know what it is? It's a log. Why would somebody in 1600 in London haul a log up to the 3rd story and run it from one side of an alley to another? And the answer is to keep their houses from falling down. London in 1600 was badly built and badly maintained. Paris in 1600 was no better. And it was time for things to get better. The Italian Renaissance had figured out how to build cities in a better way. Northern Europe was a little slow to pick up on this, but it was time for Northern Europe to begin to learn from the Italians. And who did this first? The Dutch. The Dutch had their golden age of art in the 1600s. Here is Vermeer's painting of a girl with a pearl earring. Who was this girl? We don't know. People have made movies and written novels trying to fantasize about it. The essence of the Dutch achievement in painting is to take ordinary people in ordinary situations and discover the beauty in them. Well, Vermeer didn't just discover beauty, he created it. And then Rembrandt was no worse. The Dutch made reality beautiful. Ordinary, middle-class, humdrum, everyday reality. They saw that it was beautiful and they figured out how to depict its beauty without putting on airs, without prettifying it. And the generation of Vermeer and Rembrandt, the golden age of Dutch painters, was the generation in which the Dutch turned the rattletrap shacks of Northern European cities into architecture. It was the Dutch who first figured out how to build the houses of middle-class city dwellers in durable materials like brick. And the Dutch were the first people who figured out how to mass produce brick. You can't have brick-built cities without mass production of bricks, and the Dutch figured that out. The Dutch were also the first people to touch the architecture of middle-class dwellings with the magic wand of classical antiquity. Whether you're looking like the curly-cued top of a Baroque church or just bringing in these slimy tritons. By the 1630s, the Dutch are building the first recognizable row houses in the world. And this is the generation of Rembrandt, the generation of Vermeer. By the 1650s, they are building fully classical houses. These houses no longer have those gabled fronts. They have classical cornices, architraves, you might call them, large windows to the extent that they have decorations. The decorations are like the garlands of classical art and architecture, or the columns beside doorways. The Dutch invent what we think of as the row house, pardon the airplane going overhead, and they do it by the middle of the 1600s. Not far away from Holland, and in close relations with it, is England. England was in very close relations with Holland in the 1600s, sometimes peaceful and sometimes in naval warfare. At any rate, when the city of London burnt down in 1666, the English knew what they wanted the new London to be like. Parliament passed a Rebuilding Act, and the Rebuilding Act required what you see in this slide. This is London as London was rebuilt after the Great Fire of 1666, and this is London rebuilt on the Dutch model. The British had been experimenting, or specifically Londoners had been experimenting with Dutch-style classicism all through the 1630s, 40s, and 50s. And that's a part of the research that I found was fun and a part of the book that's fun. But by 1666, England needed to mass produce housing to rebuild London after the fire, and London was rebuilt on the Dutch model. So the Dutch way of building crosses over to London, and over the next century, it spreads from London throughout the British Isles. This is, I think, not just the most beautiful of row house cities, this may be the most beautiful city I know. This vies with Paris. If you happen to be a bird, this is how the British city of Bath looks to you, with marvelous geometry. But you don't have to be a bird. If you're just walking around Bath, Bath is still a magical place. And you would look at this and you would say, is this the palace of a sovereign? Is this building of a government ministry? No, this is a row of houses. Every 3 windows, you get somebody else's house. These houses are about as big as the house I'm sitting in today in Baltimore, which is not too big, not too small. Goldilocks says it's just right. This is Bath, this is England, and a couple of blocks away from this, which is the Royal Crescent and the Circus in Bath, a couple of blocks away is this. If somebody showed you this slide and said, this is a palace that the Empress Catherine the Great built on the outskirts of St. Petersburg, some of you might shrug and say, okay, I believe that. This is not a czar's palace or a czarina's palace. This is a row of houses. And these houses are neither bigger nor smaller than houses in 83rd Street or West End Avenue. They're neither bigger nor smaller than the house I'm sitting in Baltimore right now. But they're formed into a structure of unexampled grandeur, showing that if ordinary people work together, they can achieve grandeur and power. Bath, what a place. The Scots liked Bath. You can tell that because they copied it in building the new town of Edinburgh. It took them more than 100 years to build it, from 1770 to 1877, but they stuck with the Bath formula. Again, if you're a bird, it's hard to tell the new town of Edinburgh apart from Bath itself. And if you're not a bird, it's still difficult. They're very similar places. And the capital of the second largest city in the British Empire didn't copy Bath, it copied London itself. This is Dublin, Ireland. And of all the places that I visited without knowing anything about them in advance, Dublin was the one that gave me the biggest and most pleasant surprises. Dublin is not particularly photogenic. I don't know why. Even my pictures of Dublin don't look good. But Dublin, when you're there, is an Amsterdam-class city. It is one of the great cities of the world, and it's one of the great row house cities of the world, a great North Atlantic city. Well, at the same time as the Dutch were inventing the row house, they were founding your city. They were founding New Netherlands and New Amsterdam. And here is an early picture of New Amsterdam. And you will see that it is full of houses with gables fronting on the street. What did they look like? they probably looked more or less like this. My guess is that Johannes Vermeer would have felt to some extent at home in New Amsterdam. Uh, the town got off to a start that was Dutch politically and Dutch architecturally. As we all know, the British took it away from the Dutch. New Amsterdam became New York. And over the next century, the Dutch and the English merged in a culture that I think is best symbolized by the name Franklin Roosevelt. Uh, Dutch New York, English New York. And here is a picture of Federal Hall down at Wall Street, about 1800, that shows some Dutch-looking buildings, some English-looking buildings, New York coming together. It's not particularly stylish yet, but it's on the road, and it moves on that road pretty fast. Here is Broadway at 1828 from the Bowling Green, and this is a fine, fine North Atlantic streetscape. New York by 1828 is building beautiful buildings and beautiful, beautiful streets, and building them in the Dutch tradition, building them in the English or British tradition, building them in the North Atlantic tradition. In 1825, your ancestors in New York build New York's first residential square. Boy, I wish I had seen this place. You have often been here. I don't know if you know where St. John's Square is now, but if you've ever been caught in a traffic jam trying to get into the Holland Tunnel to go to New Jersey, that's where this is. That's what stood where all that mess around Varick Street is today. And this is one of the great creations of the North Atlantic tradition, sadly swept away. By the 1830s, New York developers and builders are building houses that have survived down to our time. The beautiful row on Washington Square. I love to show this to audiences in other cities and ask them if they know which city it is. The sharp-eyed people can read NYU on the flag, and that sort of gives it away. But otherwise, it's hard to tell. It could be Philadelphia, it could be Dublin. It's a city in the North Atlantic tradition. Some bright soul, and I wish I knew who, discovered that brownstone could be used as a facing material for brick row houses. New York happened to be close to the brownstone quarries of Connecticut and New Jersey. And so New York's variant of the row house came to be and to be known as the brownstone. Edith Wharton said that New York City in her day looked as if somebody had poured cold chocolate sauce over it. So you adapted the row house to have a brownstone front. And I would dearly love to know why it is that the brownstones of 19th century New York have such high basements and such enormous front stoops. There's a good book, Bricks and Brownstone, but it doesn't talk about it. And I haven't found anybody else who has written about it. I should call Andrew Dolkart. Andrew, if you're on this Zoom, I'd love to know. And it's not just Manhattan. Conceivably, my favorite row house neighborhood in the whole world is Brooklyn Heights. So you New Yorkers built a great city in the North Atlantic tradition. And that was the totality of New York architecture up past the year 1850. There's a wonderful novel by Herman Melville, the one that he wrote just before Moby Dick, and his character is an American sailor who sails from New York over to Liverpool. And he has all these romantic dreams of what England is going to be like, and he gets off in Liverpool, and he's very disappointed to find that it looks exactly like New York. That's because New York is part of the North Atlantic tradition of building cities. But something happened. Something happened along the way. Here is a beautiful row of, well, I don't think it's a beautiful row. It's a row of big New York houses in 22nd Street called London Terrace. You can tell that they wanted people to think that this was what London looked like. London Terrace from about 1840. Something happened. Somewhere along the line, the row houses of London Terrace became the London Terrace Apartments. New York took a road that London and Amsterdam and Dublin and Edinburgh and Bath were not taking. New York also took a road that Boston and Philadelphia and Baltimore and Washington were not taking. New York became a city that had a lot of apartments and apartment houses. Why? How did that happen? If you fly over London today and look at Kensington Gardens and Hyde Park, you will see that most of the buildings that surround that great central park of London are still 4 and 5 stories tall. There are some tall buildings, but you notice them. When you fly over Central Park in New York, everything is quite different. The shortest buildings that front the park are 10 or 15 stories tall. And if New York didn't have office buildings south of 59th Street, you would be excused for thinking that the Upper West Side and the Upper East Side were the business centers of a major city. New York took a path that London and Amsterdam, Philadelphia and Washington did not take. New York became, after the middle of the 19th century, a city of dense apartment houses. By the end of the 19th century, when London was building houses like this for working class families, New York was still building tenements. There's nothing remotely this dense in London or Amsterdam, but in New York there is. Why? In the 20th century, when Londoners wanted to live more cheaply in smaller households with fewer servants, on average, they took the huge old row houses of fashionable London and divided them into large commodious apartments, like what you see in Dial M for Murder. New Yorkers, on the other hand, built whole streets and whole neighborhoods of giant apartment houses with elevators. A very different road from the road that London took. Why? Well, here's why. At the beginning of the 19th century, if people wanted to get anywhere, they had to walk. A very few rich people had carriages, but not many, and there was no mass transit. People had to walk. So, since most people worked, they had to walk to work. And how far were they willing to walk? Well, they're willing to walk about an hour. And walking about an hour is about 3 miles. So you say, okay, if you've got your jobs concentrated in one place, as many cities do, how much land is within a 1-hour walk of that concentration of jobs? In London, there is an enormous amount of land within a 1-hour walk of the job bases of London. London in 1800 had 2 big job bases, the City of London for business and Westminster for government. And London is flat, the river is narrow, there are lots of bridges, and even before there were lots of bridges, there were lots of cheap guys who would row you across the river. So London was able to use 2 big circles, each with a radius of 3 miles and a diameter of 6 miles. And London had an enormous amount of land available for settlement that was within walking distance of London's 2 big job bases. Here's New York, same scale. The job base of old New York was Lower Manhattan. And New York is a long, skinny island. You walk 3 miles north of Wall Street and it's still only a mile wide. You can't walk south because there's water. You can't walk west because there's water. You can't walk east because there's water. New Yorkers who needed to be within an hour's walk of Lower Manhattan had much less land available to them than Londoners did. And here's the scale comparison. London on the right, New York on the left. I haven't done the percentages. My guess is that London had about 12 times more buildable land within 3 miles of its job bases than New York did. And you can see that in the population densities of the 2 cities in the year 1850. Blue is London, and London had about 50,000 people per square mile in 1850. Red is New York. New York had more than 160,000 people per square mile in 1850. This is not 1900. This is not the Lower East Side. This is not crossing Delancey or Hester Street. This is New York City in 1850, and it is 3 times denser than London. It has 3 times more people per acre than London does. And if you want to understand this story, there is a marvelous book that I recommend to you. I learned a huge amount from it. Manhattan for Rent, 1785, 1850. A wonderful, wonderful, wonderful book about your city that'll teach you more about New York than I learned from reading Gotham or the Encyclopedia of New York City or anything else. Just a wonderful, wonderful book. After the middle of the 19th century, all of these cities have mass transit. For most of the time, it is horse-drawn streetcars, horse cars, the British call them trams. And horse cars, on average, could go twice as fast as a person could walk. So you no longer had to live within 3 miles of work. You could now live within 6 miles of work. And this had quite an effect on the amount of land that was available to people to live in. On Manhattan Island, you could live as far north as Central Park or even a little bit above it. So you get the Dakota built in 72nd Street in the horse car era. That's great. But Manhattan is still only about a mile wide. You get about 6 square miles. And look what London gets. London gets these giant circles, 12 miles across, with a relatively flat land, the easily bridgeable rivers. London has vastly, vastly more usable, livable space than New York. And here again is the scale. New York on the left, London on the right. Londoners have much more land to choose from, and as a result, London land is much cheaper. In 19th century New York, land increased astronomically in value. And if you owned a lot of it, as the Astors did, you became as rich as the Astors. In London, between 1800 and 1900, land at the suburban fringe did not increase in value at all because London had enough land for its people. We saw how London in 1850 was only 1/3 as dense as New York. Well, by 1880, when mass transit has had an effect, London is only half as dense as it was in 1850. London has only about 25,000 people to the square mile. That's what my Baltimore has today. Look at New York. It's come down a bit. It's come down from 160,000, but it's still at 135,000 people per acre. New York in 1880 was 5.5 times denser than London. And it's because London had vastly more land that people could live on. So London had overcrowded slums. Everybody has seen pictures of the overcrowded slums of London, and they weren't any picnic. But they weren't like the Lower East Side. New York had the densest neighborhoods in the Western world by 1900. Completely unique. And it's because there just wasn't much land for the people to live in and be close to the business center of one of the world's most dynamic commercial cities. When the two cities got really rapid transit, when they got subways, that again changed things. But it changed things more in London than it did in New York, and for the same simple reason. Here's a map of the London Underground in the 1930s. The business center of London is more or less in the center of that map. And the various lines of the London Underground go out in all directions. They go north, they go south, they go east, they go west, they go northeast, southwest. They go in all directions. There's nothing in the way of them. And so London, in the age of the Underground, became a quasi-suburban city. And the Metropolitan line of the Underground, which owned a lot of right-of-way and became a real estate developer, promoted its developments as metro land and made them look like rural villages. And when you walk along them, that's believable. These are row houses, but they have gardens in front, they're green. This is how London used its underground. How did New York use, oh yeah, and this one, I've got one of my favorite pictures of interwar London development. Very, very beautiful stuff. This is absolutely typical London middle-class development between the two world wars. And this is London public housing, council housing, they call it in England. This is 1920s public housing in London. It looks like an English village. This is how London used the enormous amount of land that people had at their disposal because the topography was gentle and the London Underground could go in all directions. Here is the subway map of New York, pardon the graininess. The New York subway is a huge and ambitious system, as big as London's, but it doesn't run in all directions. Does it run west? No, it doesn't cross the Hudson. Does it go south? No, can't get into New York Bay. It can go north, and it does. It can go east, and it does, but it can't go west, it can't go south. And so even the magnificence of the New York subway could not put as much buildable land at the disposal of New Yorkers as the London Underground put at the disposal of Londoners. So New York, around World War I and between the world wars, was able to build precisely two developments on the London model. This is New York's first garden city. This is Forest Hills Gardens, begun in 1913, 1914. Lovely place. And here also in Queens is Sunnyside Gardens, built in 1922, 24, 25. Louis Mumford lived there. That looks like petty bourgeois London or petty bourgeois Baltimore, but it needed charitable donations, foundation support to build. So did Forest Hills Gardens. In London, this stuff was happening as a result of market forces because people had lots of land. In New York, they didn't have lots of land, and it took charitable foundations to produce small, middle-class row house neighborhoods. There wasn't enough charity to go around, so most of the 600,000 housing units that New York built between the wars looked something like this. This became the New York outer borough streetscape. Very different from London and from the other North Atlantic cities because of New York's unique geography. So what about the Upper West Side? The Upper West Side is the most wonderful both and place I know in the North Atlantic world. Is it a district of apartment houses? Yes. Is it a district of row houses or brownstones? Yes. Is it one or the other? No, it's both. Here's the back of the Dakota with row houses in the background and construction in the foreground. Both and. The Upper West Side has some of the most beautiful rows of houses anywhere in the world. If you like these high Victorian brownstone Renaissance facades, you can't do better than you can do in the Upper West Side. If your taste runs to the Georgian Revival, you can't do better than you can do in the Upper West Side. The Upper West Side is one of the great row house districts in the world. But it also has some of the greatest apartment buildings in the world. It's not one or the other, it's both one and the other. And here is my sentimental favorite among the apartment buildings of the Upper West Side. This is the Paterno at 116th and Riverside. My wife grew up right at the corner on the first floor there. And many a good Thanksgiving dinner I've had. Sometimes I could even find a parking space if I had to drive up. So the Upper West Side is a both and place and a wonderful one. And it even has its own Park Avenue. Now you're going to look at that and you're going to say, well, golly, Mr. Duff, you began by saying that your book was about cities that had row houses. I don't see any row houses in this picture. Is this part of the story of the North Atlantic cities? And the answer is that everything that the North Atlantic cities do is a part of the story of the North Atlantic cities. The seed that was planted in Holland in 1600 was planted in the form of a row house. But the different cities then grew, and some grew in very similar ways. And the one that grew in a very different way was New York because of its unique geography. But the apartment buildings that New York pioneered have become a gift to the rest of the North Atlantic cities and have in general been used very well to enrich the lives of their people. So you don't have to believe me. You can look at the back cover of my book. The front cover is an old Dutch row house. The back cover is Park Avenue in New York. So I want to thank you for being a part of one of my favorite places in the world, the Upper West Side of New York. It's not just a wonderful place, it's a wonderful part of a North Atlantic city. And the North Atlantic cities are a kind of city, a family of cities, and I hope we can all learn to think about them as such. I also hope you'll buy my book. Authors like to sell books. It's a lot of trouble to write them. It's difficult to buy books in a pandemic, but the book has a website. There's the address, pretty simple, northatlanticcities.com. And if you buy a copy of the North Atlantic Cities and mention, and either do it today or mention Landmarks West, or just give a mailing address on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, I will give a bookseller's commission, which is 40% to Landmarks West. I have the American rights and I can do that. So Andra,